to our next session of the future of business immigration after Trudeau, trends and predictions. As we navigate the ever-changing landscape of Canadian business immigration, understanding past trends and anticipating future shifts is crucial. That's why we're honored to have with us a true leader in this space, Phil Mooney. Phil is an RCIC with over 25 years of experience in the immigration industry. His background also includes over 30 years of experience in the corporate world, giving him a unique and valuable perspective on the intersection between business and immigration. He currently serves as co counsel to numerous immigration professionals. Beyond his consulting work, Phil has shaped the very foundations of immigration regulation in Canada. He was actually the first CEO of ICCRC, where he helped transition oversight from its predecessor, CSIC. As a past president of CAPIC, he has been an advocate for immigration professionals, frequently presenting before Parliament committee and mentoring the next generation of practitioners. Today, Phil will take us through the evolution of business immigration under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, examining the past, the present, and potential future of key programs, from passive investment and PNPs to federal immigration streams. He'll also provide insight into today's market challenges, including lower numbers, stricter adjudication, fraud risks, and the often limited pathways to permanent residence. Most importantly, he'll discuss what's next. Could passive investment programs return? Could we see a dramatic policy shift in the next 6 months? Let's dive into this discussion and explore what the future holds for Canadian business immigration. Thank you for joining.
Hello, everyone. My name is Phil Mooney. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant, and I would like to thank Joorney for this opportunity to talk to you today about business immigration, past, present, and the future. Why should you listen to me? Okay, well, for one thing, I've been around for a long time. After 30 years in the corporate world, where I was all kinds of roles up to senior management, I started up my immigration practice working 25 years ago effectively as a franchisee for a company that was solely involved in helping Canadians go to the US. I worked in that business, especially in the fields of business immigration, for several years. And then as Canadian immigration became regulated and immigration consultants became regulated, I started my own practice in Canadian immigration and have been practicing in that area ever since, mostly in the field of business immigration. But along the way, I've had the opportunity to not only deal with many business clients. I got involved with our association, CAPIC. I was head of CAPIC for several years when we had to deal extensively with the government, especially as we were trying to improve regulation of immigration consultants. And in 2011, I became the first CEO of the current regulator of immigration consultants. At the time, it was ICCRC. Now it's the college. So for all of you Canadian immigration consultants, my background is in business and then in the immigration field. And as I will be talking today a bit about what to expect from the government, I have had extensive experience in working with the department and the government on building programs. Okay, so let's get started. Business immigration, past, present, and the future. And you just had the intro. So what can you expect from this session? Okay. Well, first of all, you have to understand why we are where we are. All right. To say that the Canadian immigration scene is somewhat uncertain, turbulent, ever-changing is always an understatement. So hopefully I can help you understand how we got here. Because in learning how we got here and in learning how the department and politicians have responded to other crises in the past, we can better understand what's likely to happen in the future. We'll be able to understand how immigration programs are made. You might all of us basically get a notice and saying, here, these are the rules of the program. Here's when they start. These are changes to the act, etc. Well, how does that all happen? Okay. Then it's what to expect in the short and long term. The only thing I can't give you a brief on is what to expect from the current tariff situation, because it changes every 10 minutes. And as this program was recorded a week or so before the event, I have no idea what the tariff situation is going to look like at the time you're viewing this. But in terms of other immigration programs in the medium, short, and long term, I'll give you some ideas on what you can expect. Then, to work in business immigration, I'll let you know what are the essential skills you need. If you're thinking of doing more in this area, or if you've got the opportunity to do more in this area, you need to understand why this is probably the most complex area of immigration. Okay. We will talk somewhat, although not in great detail, about all of the business immigration programs. That includes startup visas, provincial nomination programs, and the host of other acronyms, which all of you will become very familiar with as time goes by. Immigration loves acronyms. Then we'll talk about, from any and all of these programs, what are the paths to PR. Finally, you were kind enough to send in many questions which you think are important to you. So what I would like to do is deal with each of those questions, allow enough time to do so. Make sure that if we haven't covered them during the presentation, we will deal with them at the end of the presentation. If time runs out, then I can promise you that through Joorney, we will email you answers to any of your questions that you have already posted. Or if you have questions as you listen to this program and sitting in your offices, if you get additional questions, you have my email address, which was on the cover slide. It's phil@immc3.ca. Okay. You can send me those questions either through Joorney or directly, and I promise you we'll give you an answer. After all, that's what these sessions are all about. It's sharing knowledge so that we all have more knowledge. So, a little bit about history. For many of you, this will be the history of business immigration. For me, it was current events, okay? Because I think I've been around through almost all of it. So first of all, business immigration programs such as intercompany transfers, treaty traders, treaty investors, have been around since the 1980s with little change. Why is this important? Well, if you're looking for a program that you can offer to one of your clients, and you've been victimized in the past by sudden changes in policy, changes in rules, changes in laws, these programs are virtually the same as they were 30 and 40 years ago. And that's because they're part of treaties. Countries don't change treaties every day. Even Donald Trump won't be changing every treaty every day. Okay, treaties take a long time to negotiate, and their rules tend to stay the same for long periods of time with only minor adjustments. So if you want to know how to do an ICT, I can tell you that the way and the things I learned about doing ICTs in Canada and L1s in the United States are almost exactly the same. In fact, 99% of it is the same as it was then. Okay, so these are stable programs, and in the past they were work permit programs for Canada, so they weren't as important as other immigration programs that led to permanent residence. Because most programs, IRPA, the Immigration Refugee Protection Act, came in 2002, and most of the programs that were offered and most of the business that immigration consultants and lawyers had to deal with were permanent resident programs. There was no or little thought to any sort of pathway to permanent residence where you came to Canada as a student, you came to Canada as a worker or a visitor, and then you got to become a permanent resident, through that pathway. In fact, the only way to do it, and it was not even simple, was if you came to Canada and you married a Canadian and got sponsored. So there were no basically pathways from temporary residence to permanent residence. In fact, coming to Canada when IRPA first came in, if you had a permanent resident application in, and then you wanted to come to Canada to visit or work, you were denied, because that was dual intent. In fact, the US still has rules much like that. Unless you're in a very specific number, a very few number of visas and work permits to the US, if you're coming to the U.S. to become a permanent resident or to Canada at the time, you could not do it unless you had already been approved. Okay, so most people came to Canada as permanent residents. There were two main business immigration programs from the federal government, and there were no provincial programs. Okay, so first you had the treaty programs to come as workers, not permanent residents. Then you had two programs called, one was the Federal Investor Program, and the second was the Federal Entrepreneur Program. Okay, and in the early 2000s, we were admitting 10 to 20,000 permanent resident admissions per year for those two programs. Well, what happened to them? Well, the Federal Investor Program required an investment of $1 million. And the one good thing that the Canadian Immigration Department did was they made sure that everyone's money was safe by dealing only through financial intermediaries like banks. So you didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars going into private companies and being managed by them. You had monies coming into banks effectively, which were then loaned to the federal government. But one of the advantages of the program for consultants and lawyers were the fees were very high. These immigration or facilitators meant that you didn't have to give the government all your money. What you did was you basically prepaid the interest on the money, and you gave that to the facilitator, who then lent capital to the government. So the commissions on those sort of files were very high. All right, you could earn $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for every client you got, and the paperwork was extreme, if you will, compared to most and any other immigration application. And the demand started to get pretty high, and right around the same time, when IRPA first came in, and this goes back in history, the Immigration Department promised the government that there was a backlog of some 75,000 files, that they would all be looked after in the first 6 months after IRPA was proclaimed. Well, they didn't do that. They extended it 3 more months, and then 9 months after IRPA, so basically in March of 2003, they just canceled all of the applications they had in inventory. Well, that didn't go over very well, since those were people all who had applied for permanent residence. And there was a class action suit, which lawyers won on behalf of the clients. And it was so extreme that the judge accused the Minister of Immigration and the Department of lying to Parliament. So they had to reinstate all 75,000 files. That was the start of what we hadn't really seen before, namely backlogs in immigration. And one of the things that happened with backlogs, in those days, these were all paper files. So in addition to the files that they were receiving, all paper, all applications, they had to hold on to another 75,000 files and process them. And guess what? In a whole lot of consulates and embassies where the processing was done, they were running out of space. So some very brilliant person in the Immigration Department decided that for a federal investor, where these files are hundreds and hundreds of pages, that you didn't have to submit all of that to get started in the system. All you had to do was tell the government your name and address and basically your passport, and say that you were interested with a brief explanation. And it was basically a 3-page application, and you got your place in the line. Well, as you can imagine, a whole lot of unscrupulous people outside of Canada, because at those times also anyone could prepare a file. Okay, these individuals, including lawyers, consultants, and very many ghost consultants, started selling the program, taking $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 deposits, okay, and only filling in 3 pieces of paper. Well, as you can imagine, the volume of applications went through the roof. And over the next few years, even though they were only accepting a few thousand a year, they were getting 5,000 and 10,000 applications that were now holding up in the queue. And the numbers got so large that eventually the government did something which we always objected to, but turned out to be illegal. They just canceled the whole program. Canceled all of the applications in the program, and more than 20,000 individuals had their files returned to them. So that was the end of the federal investor program. Quebec has continued with a program which is basically inoperable now because the demands are so high. But that's one of the 2 investor programs. The second one was the entrepreneur program, which was the opposite of the investor program is really simple. You just had to say, I have a business idea. I'm going to come to Canada. And all the government said was, okay, we're going to give you permanent residence. But within 2 years, you had to hire at least 2 Canadians. Okay. And if you don't hire 2 Canadians, we're going to take away your permanent residence. Well, you can guess what happened. Hundreds and thousands of people applied through that program. They were approved. They came to Canada. But a bunch of them couldn't meet the requirements for various reasons. And it turned out that the federal government didn't know where they were, didn't know how to track them down. And ultimately, somewhere around 2011, they just surrendered. And they just said, okay, everybody who applied and who came here, your permanent residence, they took away the condition. But they killed the program, right? And then finally, the P&P programs have suffered similar fates. As all of this was going on, they started with provincial nominee programs. Each of those programs had an entrepreneur program. And because the federal government didn't understand how to do immigration programs, they didn't oversee the provinces very well. And you ended up with a whole lot of P&P programs where effectively it was a cash grab, okay? And you had situations where we're getting news stories about government officials flying back from Hong Kong with suitcases full of cash. Well, they may have all been well-intentioned, but you can imagine what that looked like. And eventually the government shut down several provincial programs in some provinces 2 and 3 times. So the provinces responded by making their programs more and more and more complex, to the point where now the complexities are so great, it's very difficult to handle. So that's how the government deals with programs when they get in trouble. But the whole environment has changed greatly since then. Okay. So how do they get these programs, right? You can pretty well say that 50% of the current programs in existence were designed by committee. Half of them were in response to Parliament. Politicians can influence how the immigration department works and what Canada's priorities are, and that is their job. So some of the programs would be public policy that has been developed by political parties, introduced into Parliament, accepted, and then the department has to go away and make it work. Okay, and that's things like spousal programs and refugee programs, etc. That's typically what Parliament, and that's how you end up with the programs we have now. About 10% of the programs are simply copycat. The department has a problem and they don't know how to solve it, so they look at other similar countries, and there's only 5 or 6. And if they see it, they like. And this is exactly how we ended up with Express Entry. Okay, New Zealand had started this program, and the government's problem and why they introduced Express Entry was because, just like with investors, the original skilled worker program only required you to get 67 points out of 100. But another requirement was that if you filed that application, the government was obligated to process it. So as more and more people found out how to work with this program, more and more people applied. And they didn't know how to create or to manage intake. They tried different things over the years, including quotas, including specific job lists. They were nightmares. And all of us who lived through 2008 to 2012, 13, know how difficult those times were. Well, Express Entry was the answer to all their prayers, because it said, you're not applying to Canadian immigration. You're just sending us a profile, and we're not even charging you for it. And then we will choose what's going to happen. And we were skeptical at the time, but I would have to say that in terms of a processing program, it's worked remarkably well. It controls intake. And if you can control intake, you can manage a program. When you can't control intake, you get study permits by the millions. Okay, so the government has been learning these lessons, but they don't always learn the lessons for long, and they don't always learn it with one mistake. Some of the programs come in on the fly. An example would be when Justin Trudeau was elected, he declared that they were going to admit 50,000 refugees from Syria immediately, because the urgent need. I mean, that was a terrible time, and the publicity around that the refugee program and the Syrian civil war was terrible. We all remember those kinds of images. So here comes a brand new prime minister, and he brings in this program to admit 50,000. The department wasn't ready for it. They didn't know how to do it. So he did the next best thing. He got somebody from the military to run the program and to make sure it happened. And I met this individual at a couple of sessions, and he said, look, the department told us point blank they couldn't do it, and we told them they did it or they got fired. Does kind of sound familiar? Anyway, that program came in. In some ways it was successful, but it absolutely blew apart the sponsored persons, the groups that could get together and sponsor immigrants because the demand was so high. It also allowed individuals who were not in Syria, who were wealthy individuals in other countries. They left because of the war, but they had money. It allowed those individuals to come to Canada and, I mean, just to apply. They didn't have to go through any other process. They could come and get refugee status. You know, the SUV program was another one. When they canceled the federal investor program and the entrepreneur program, government looked around and says, we don't have a federal business program. And at the time, the Minister of Immigration had been down to Silicon Valley and came back and said, I saw how they're encouraging entrepreneurs. So bring me a program that rewards innovators, people. We want the next Steve Jobs. The fact of the matter is, if Steve Jobs had wanted to come to Canada in those days, he wouldn't have been able to because he was ineligible. He was ineligible for drug use and other things. But they wanted innovators, okay, to come in. So they brought out this pilot program for SUV. And we didn't pay much attention at the time simply because it was so difficult to manage. And there were other programs that we were working with, including the other federal programs. The PNP programs were growing rapidly. You know, and the program struggled, and after 5 years, it had only admitted 75 people into Canada. That's families. I mean, 75 individuals, including their families, over 5 years. And we thought for sure they were going to cancel it. Instead, they made it permanent. And when they made it permanent, they put it on their website, and they made it so simple that we have what we have today. And I'll get into some of that. Some of them, programs they get maybe 10% from the squeaking wheel. Provinces say, hey, we need programs. We need people in Northern Ontario. We need people in Northern British Columbia. So you get programs like the regional programs. Some of them are abuse control, like canceling PNP entrepreneur programs overnight because they didn't like the ethics of the program. So the changes we just saw over last year to the study permit process, these are for abuse control. The LMIA changes. In 2014, they shut the entire program down for 3 or 4 months. Then recently, last fall, they came in with more changes to the LMIA program, you know, which they believe is going to combat fraud. And in January, they even came out with a special punitive program against consultants who advise clients misrepresent. Okay, these are abuse control. Then if you get to what maybe most of you expected to see, a program that is planned, well planned, thought out, supported by research, that's probably less than 10% of the immigration programs. So it did give us something called CEC, which in the early days, by the way, wasn't very successful. Okay, it took a few years to get going, problems with the federal skilled worker program before it gained any kind of volume. Our caregiver programs, of which the program to come out at the end of March is probably the 3rd iteration, but they tend to have been spent, a lot of time is spent on them. And just so you know about who has influence here, the department develops the program. Minister of Immigration can influence it, but because they change every 6 or 10 months, very, very few of them have been strong enough. The only one I can recall is Jason Kenney, who was there for maybe 3 years, because that was politically a good thing for the Conservatives to do. The rest of it hasn't just, their programs have very little input from people who know the system. And there are only 2 groups of people who understand how the system works. That's the department and immigration practitioners. Everyone else has a very minor understanding, including members of parliament, including members of other consumer groups. But the department will, on every program, take and say they consulted with the public. But the consultations come from a checklist that say, did you talk to the Chamber of Commerce? Did you talk to the conference board? Did you talk to these people? And yeah, they have the meetings, they talk to them. But I've been in those meetings, and frankly, because those groups don't understand how the system works, their input is completely disregarded, in my opinion. Okay, so this is how programs get done. And it takes very strong lobbying by groups like the CBA, Immigration Group, and CAPIC in regular meetings to get things changed. everything else becomes just so much chaff. And it's only when the program comes in and has all kinds of mistakes that they change it. Okay. So what do we expect? I've been asked this question many times. Now that Trudeau is resigning, he hasn't quite gone. There's another day or two left. And when we're going to have an election and possibly the Conservatives will come in, a year ago, people were saying this is going to create even more change. This is going to be a really big deal. Well, the Liberals, true to form, stole all of the ideas that everybody had on how to fix the program and put them in place already. So you're not going to have, the opposition can't claim to say if they come into power, they're going to fix the study permit program. That's already been fixed and then some. The same with the temporary foreign worker programs. The same with permanent resident targets have been reduced. The Liberals have now done all of these things to take the wind out of the sail, just like they canceled the carbon tax. Okay, so it's going to be interesting to see. But the real issue will be that there are things happening that means neither the Conservatives nor the Liberals or even the NDP, if they got in as a power to be, none of those people are going to change the immigration program much, simply because we have a problem that is systemic, that has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with bodies. All right. And we will be in a demographic bind if we do not continually increase immigration to replace the 5 million baby boomers who are retiring by 2030. That's 5 million jobs. And there are only 2 million Gen Zs, I think it is, who will be coming of age to go into the workforce. 50 to 100,000 people leave every year. People die every year. So we have this massive problem that we will not be able to sustain our economy unless we increase immigration, and the numbers that we've seen now have been reduced from their original targets. Look for that in 2 to 3 years to go back up. Okay, and then the rest of this is all just which program works and which doesn't. Okay, so I don't look for major political changes. Okay, major changes in politics to change anything. The other and probably saddest part of this is they have rarely had any kind of a focus on business immigration. They've been quick to cancel them, slow to add them, and very quick to make them really complicated. There will be no focus or attention paid to business immigration programs over the next 3 or 4 years. Doesn't mean there won't be changes, but there just won't be any attention and no priority given. Right now, the government has 2 massive immigration problems. One is we've got 7 to 10 years worth of refugee files, and they're going to have to do something about that. The second one is that we have 1 to 2 million temporary residents in Canada and people who will become out of status in Canada over the next 2 to 3 years. They have to manage those problems. And they don't manage those problems by adding business immigration or by adding any new programs to attract other immigrants. And you're already seeing some of the changes. Okay. So right now, what the government has done, because of the temporary resident problem, what they don't want to have happen is for hundreds of thousands of individuals who came to Canada with the expectation of becoming permanent residents, eventually using up their study permit options, their postgrad work permit options, and others who have come here to work who may or may not be needed because the economy goes up and down. They don't want to create a whole class of individuals who are out of status in Canada. Because if you end up with a class, then you end up with a situation like the US, where now you've got huge numbers of people who are out of status, who are afraid of getting caught and deported. Okay, and those individuals are very vulnerable to being victimized by criminal elements and others, and they're also very vulnerable to not respecting the law, and they will not report criminal activities, because if you call the police and they come and find out you're illegal, and that means you're going to lose and you're going to have to leave Canada. So the government knows they can't do that. At the same time, Canada's not good at deporting people. We deport people all the time in small numbers. Maybe we were deporting 5,000 people a year, 10,000. Well, what happens when you've got 1 million people out of status? Okay? If you have 1 million people out of status, how do you deport them? You can be sure that the public will not stand for scenes like having an army bus pull up in front of a church, drag people out of the basement, and take them to the airport. They're not going to put up with scenes like that. So what the government's doing now is they're trying to reduce the pressure on the program. Those of you in the business know that, you know, for one step, for example, is a post-grad work permit for a student cannot be extended. And in the past, if you tried to extend it by filing just before it expired, when that file got refused because it was an ineligible application to begin with, the individuals had no recourse to restoration. What happens now if you file? Well, the government sends you a letter after a week saying you are now in maintained status until a decision is made. That means the individual is working, okay? Even though the application was wrong to begin with. That was something I never expected, but it's a release valve. The refugee program has become another relief valve, if you will, for these individuals because they've changed the process. When if you file for refugee status, even if you've been in Canada for 4 years as a student, worked 3 years, and now you're claiming refugee status, you get a work permit in 2 to 3 weeks. And the screening process to say whether or not your application is valid is going to take 3 or more years. Well, they're not doing this in blindly. They're doing this because they don't want all those people who are here working, whose status is about to expire, but they can still work, and the economy still needs the jobs. They're letting these people stay under a different temporary status, albeit with the repercussions of what happens after 3 years when your refugee claim is denied and you effectively become banned from Canada. Okay, but they'll deal with that problem in 3 years. And now we're starting to see a few more programs like the construction worker program for permanent residents. Expect more programs like that. Okay. There is going to also be an in-Canada focus. We're going to admit 365,000 people next year. I think it's 385 this year. They're trying to focus more and more of these people on those who are in Canada, which means refugees, which means individuals who are in the express entry pool, and it means others who are disadvantaged. Look for more programs like that. Okay. So that's what you can expect. Now, how should you deal with these? What is your responsibility as an authorized representative? Well, first of all, you have to stay up to date with all the changes. This is hard, but maybe instead of paying lots of attention to what tariffs are going to be imposed today or tomorrow or the next day, make sure you're watching every announcement. Just recently, there was an announcement that a whole lot of people missed that said if you're in, if you're here or you want to come here, if you enroll in a apprenticeship program, you don't need a study permit. Now, many people didn't see that because it was tied up with another announcement on improving Canada's housing market. Okay, it was from the Minister of Immigration. They're talking about how it's going to help the housing industry by getting more workers. And they said right in that there, and they've got there's a link to it on the webpage, an apprenticeship program. If to get them, you can actually get your clients into that apprenticeship program. They don't need a study permit. Okay, and the even better news is they have now replaced transportation workers and people in the transportation industry with skilled tradespeople. So all of a sudden, if you've got people coming from their post-grad work permits are expiring, and they might rather become an electrician or a carpenter or something like that, but they don't know how to bridge from what they were doing, which could have been manual labor, which could have been working in restaurants as a counter attendant. Now you can say to them, well, look, take this apprenticeship program. And when you take it and work for, I think it's 6 months, okay, you now can put your profile into express entry and the pass mark's going to be lower. Now, this is going to last maybe a year, maybe 2, depends on the demand for construction workers in Canada. Okay, so familiar yourself with all of these programs. Okay, now familiar yourself with all these programs in general. As an immigration consultant, when someone comes to us and says, I have a problem, we have 2 obligations to them. We have to identify a solution to their problem, and if we don't know, we have to pass them on to someone else. Okay, well, my idea is that you don't pass them on to someone else. What you do is make sure you're familiar in general with every immigration program. Know that there are, what the PNP skilled worker programs are. Just know what they are. You don't have to be expert in them. You don't have to know how to do the file. But at least you can advise a client that there are some options. Then if the client is interested in working with you further, now you can co-counsel. Okay, you can go to someone who already has done these. And in fact, you don't have to give up the business. Right? Because you're going to have a hard enough time doing the business the way you've been doing it over the last few years because of all the changes. And some of you may have seen your markets go away, but there are many more new markets and you don't want to give away prospects. Well, I'll talk a bit more about that later. Do not dismiss anyone's chances over the next 5 years or longer. Just because their express entry profile says they got 320 points, okay, and the pass mark's 520. Don't dismiss their chances, because look what we just saw. Okay, we saw new groups added to the express entry profiles, which will have lower pass marks. And how do you know that next year or the year after they're not going to take accountants or bookkeepers or truck drivers again? So don't dismiss anyone's chances. Just tell them there isn't a place open today. So let's keep you in status until something opens, because we know there's going to be many more changes. Okay. Look for co-counseling help to monetize your brand. Again, everyone here has sacrificed to get in this profession. You've paid money to take classes. You've learned a lot. Okay. So what you need to do is monetize the chance when somebody calls you and said, I want to come to Canada, but that's all they say. Well, if it turns out that they're 40 years old, and they've got a 2-year diploma, you know that they're not going to get 520 points, but they also happen to have $2 million or $500,000 that they can invest. So you get them here under business immigration programs, and then wait for an opportunity to get them into a permanent resident program. Okay, and use the proven business immigration programs to get status in Canada. And that's why I mentioned and started off by talking about treaty programs and federal government programs like ICT and Treaty Investor and C10 and that. Use those programs, LMIAs. Use those programs to get them here, even if we don't know how to get them to permanent resident yet. But tell your clients that, of course. Now, what do you need to do business immigration? Well, I mentioned at the start that this is one of the most complex ones. The part of the problem with business immigration is that it doesn't just mean an application for an ICT. If you're dealing with the owner of a business and you can't tell them how their children can get study permits, or deal with them on study permits, or help their spouse get a work permit, or help them do other get other immigration benefits, they're just not going to trust you on the business side either. Okay. You also need to be a project manager, because you're going to be dealing with accountants, lawyers, realtors, and all of those will be interacting with your client, and you have to make sure you control the message when it comes to immigration. They might find a fabulous business opportunity, and it's doing something that they really want to do. It's in Alberta, and then you find out that it's a coin-op laundry. Okay, you want to find out it's a coin-op laundry because they will not allow it. Or in BC, same thing, they will not allow those kind of businesses. But the realtor has already got money. So you have to make sure you understand and you have to control the information with regards to immigration. The timelines are really important. And how many of you have great confidence in the government's ability to deliver on any of their posted timelines? Well, I know if I was looking at a show of hands, I wouldn't see a single hand raised, because the government has no credibility when it comes to timelines. And at the same time, people always underestimate times. And we tend to go along with them because it's easier to keep the client happy. So you have to make sure you manage timelines very well, right? Because when and how a person buys a business can be greatly affected by how long it takes. Okay. Consequences of failure can be practice ending. When if you make a mistake on a spousal application, you can redo it, okay, or you can refund the money. You make a mistake on a business application and somebody, loses money on their business anytime in the next 10 years, they can come after you, and they'll have the money to pay a lawyer who will be only too happy to tell them what you did wrong. Okay. So the time from your initial assessment, when you get that initial lead until you actually file, is much longer than a normal program. At the same time, you have to be fully transparent. I think in all of my dealings with business clients, my favorite saying is, by the time you're finished, you too could be an immigration consultant. Okay. Because we have to explain everything to them. That's the only way to keep them satisfied, because they're busy running their business, but they have expectations. And the expectation is they paid money, they expect to succeed. Okay. And for that, you also need to communicate constantly. I work with and co-counsel with other clients on business immigration, and on many of them, they will deal over a 6 or 8 month period. We'll have bi-weekly, it means every 2 weeks, phone video calls with their clients. Just always to deal with little details. Okay. At the same time, there's compensation there because the fees are much higher. Okay. So, sorry, went two programs. Just so you know, there's federal business immigration programs. The first one was startup visa. I'll get to that in a minute. Then work permit to PR. That's international intercompany transfer, treaty investors, C10, LMIA. All of them are precursors to express entry. Okay, the fastest to PR would be an LMIA, okay, which could be 8 to 12 months. This is assuming we still end up with arranged employment points. Intercompany transfers, treaty investors, C10, at least 18 months if they qualify under express entry and if we have arranged employment. We know the government said they want to get rid of arranged employment points. We don't know the details as to does this apply to ICTs as well. We do know that it applies to both, I believe, 50 and 250 points. But in the time since they announced they want to get rid of it, and that by the time they get around to it, maybe the world will have changed. So right now, offer it to your clients because it is there, right? If you offer it to an ICT client, they have to wait a year before they're eligible to apply. So tell them that we don't know the path to PR. Okay. SUV, I've got a special little math class here. Let me just say right away, anyone who has a client interested in the SUV program, my advice is don't. Okay? Don't. Here's the reason. We know there are about 30,000 people. First of all, when the government talks targets, they talk individuals, and that includes the applicant, their spouse, their children. Okay? So right now, there are 30,000 individuals in the queue, thereabouts. Last May, we knew that there were 45,000 self-employed and SUVs applications, individuals in the queue, of which 30,000 were those. They've accepted more applications since than they've processed. So let's say there's 30,000 in the queue. Well, no program has been hit more by the reduction in permanent resident quotas than the SUV program. You've heard of 50% drop for PNPs, 15% drop for the federal programs, express entry, et cetera. Well, the quota reduction for SUVs for 2025, the quota is now 1,000. That's an 80% reduction from their target from last year. Next year, the quota is 500. That's a 94% reduction. No other program has been affected that much. At the same time, they brought in priority applications where they allow angel investors and the Canada Tech Network and venture capitalists, they allow those individuals 10 projects a year each. Those projects are now looking for 4 to 5 families per project, which means they could be up to 4,200 individuals each year, and we can assume they all sold out last year. But there's no first in, first out. So non-priority cases that were sitting in line last year are further back because they took in more cases. And this year, if they take in another 4,200 cases and only process 1,000, guess what happens to the people already in line? They're going to go further back and further back. So no one currently in the non-priority list will ever get their files processed. And you know what happens when backlogs go too long? What will the government do? They'll just say, here's your filing fee back. New priority files will take even new priority files because they're allowing up to 4,200 people to be in the backlog every year, but they're only going to take 500 next year. I can't see them taking anything less than 10 years. The same time, their reasons for refusal files. Now, it wouldn't be so bad if they refused 80% of the files over the next 3 months, but that's not how they do it. They process the files and they take them one at a time. And when they reach the target number that they have for approval, they stop processing. They wait till next year to keep processing. So refusal reasons are really broad. We're seeing refusals now because the date of filing the letter of acceptance and then filing permanent resident, that the facilitators or the designated organizations didn't file their certificate of filing on time. At the same time, they now have a 3-year open work permit. Isn't that nice? But better be careful, because if the individuals take any actions which might possibly qualify them for any other permanent resident program, their SUV application will be denied. That's under, I think it's R90, okay? They cannot undertake any other type of application for them or their family members that gives them a different pathway to PR. So you have to offer your clients a plan B, all right? Just real quick, the ICT program, international company requirement, is turned out to be a whole lot of a red herring. First of all, it only applies to R205, which is non-treaty countries. Secondly, it doesn't apply to renewals. Third, it doesn't apply if a company is coming to Canada and buys a company in Canada, because that's two companies. And finally, if you have a large company offshore, they only have business in one country and they want to start a new business in Canada, instead of doing an ICT, you can do a C11, which is for short-term projects, get a 6-month for the senior executive, have them come in and start the company, okay? And then move them over to ICT, because by then they'll have an existing company in Canada. So here, and I'll invite you just to look at this. This is the business process flow for immigration, starting with identifying your strengths and weaknesses, then identifying the clients, and doing business with clients. I absolutely recommend use a questionnaire, because it's there to disqualify people so you don't waste your time, okay? Then the rest of it are basically things we've already talked about. You can review them when you get the presentation. Provincial, everybody talks about provincial programs. Well, first of all, they're far more complex than any business immigration for the federal government. There are nominations only after you meet contractual deadlines. The fastest program might be 2 years, but I think now that the quotas have been reduced, you have to go 4 years. Limited supply, because the PNP programs all got cut back by 50%. Okay, more than any other programs except the SUV. So that means even if they have a limited supply. The Alberta Rural Nominee Program, people like it, it's 50,000. Well, I think they took in 7 or 8 files last year, and this year maybe it'll be 3. And they probably have a waiting list now for 20 years. They also have sudden changes. They just stopped the programs, or they canceled them like Ontario just did. You also have a hard time in some provinces because these are not supported under an act. You have to appeal them to their provincial courts, which can take years and years and years. And somehow people who are local get an advantage because they know people. And so when there's small quotas, they fill them up so fast. If you've got a client on the hook for a few months as you're evaluating things, it's already too late. Okay. These are just some things, and I'll just leave you with the two most important ones. Someone calls you and you think they're a business immigrant client, find out where they want to be. Canada is a huge country, far bigger than most other countries that you're getting your clients from, and you need to let them know they have to tell you where. And the reason for that is to find a business, you might need help from a realtor. Realtors are all local, okay? Second is, what type of business? We've had people say, just give me any business that gets me into Canada. We don't take those people, okay? We don't. Then again, you can go through the rest of these. I'm sorry, I'm hurrying. I want to get to the questions because they're very important ones, okay? So questions and answers. And the print is small, okay? So let me just take a look at this. After the job offer, points are removed in the spring of 2025. How will business clients obtain an ITA? Well, as we know, we don't know. First of all, it's still in place, so keep using it. Secondly, we don't know when it will go away. And thirdly, we don't even know what will go away, if it's everything. It all depends on what happens with fraud. Now, unfortunately, the latest report I saw on fraud was that from Q1 last year to Q2, there was a 50% increase in fraud cases. So they're going to deal with that problem first. The flip side is, if they end up doing this, well, it's to make it easier it's going to reduce the pass mark on their express entry, because everyone who's in Canada who's got arranged employment is going to see their points in their profile drop, okay? Because those points are not guaranteed until they issue an ITA. How will the industry survive? This is a very important question, but let's get to the real facts, okay? Yes, all these changes make it more difficult, and you have to be alert and on your toes, but not volume. They've dropped the quota to 395,000 this year, and I think 365 next year. Forgive me if I'm off by a few thousand. That's still more than we accepted in 2019 by a considerable margin. Study permits are the biggest numbers to drop, but there's still 1 million students who need postgrad work permits. At the same time, they're going to level off, and they already are leveling off on the study permits. And most of those were not done by immigration consultants or lawyers anyway. They were done by facilitators and accumulators, acting illegally mostly, okay? So the volume of immigration application work, I believe, is going up simply because now that they can't process the files they've got, we're seeing mistake after mistake after mistake. In my first 20 years in this business, I never did a reconsideration request once. You know, it was either approved or the reason for refusal was so obvious. Even after getting an ATIP, there was no, we did very few federal appeals. Now we're doing them every week because the system makes mistakes. And we've had reconsideration requests approve a file that was previously refused in as little as 10 minutes. Sometimes it takes a few weeks. But to do a reconsideration request, you've got to do it right, and you need to charge for it. And that should be in your retainer agreement or service agreement right from the start. For the IC3, yeah, again, this is about arranged employment. We don't know, okay? How can we collectively influence the federal government? There is only one way to collectively influence the federal government on immigration, and that is through your association, either Canadian Bar Association or CAPIC. Those are the only two official voices for practitioners that the government listens to. Now, fortunately, CAPIC has a very good relationship, and you can often get things in front of the department. But there are a lot of issues. So join CAPIC, send in your suggestions and reports, get active in committees. All right. You don't have to be on the board. You don't have to be involved in onerous planning. Just get involved. That's how you can influence it. That's how I got into CAPIC. I was sending in letters and nobody was listening. Of course they weren't. It's just one person. And CIC at the time, you know, basically was dial a prayer for atheists. You know, you could dial and dial and dial and nobody would answer. What are the requirements for including minimum investment? Oh, minimum investment. The key element here is that the government must see there will be a significant investment. They don't tell us how much except provinces. The federal government doesn't say how much. The answer is whatever a visa officer considers significant, and our rule of thumb is we try to go with at least twice the visa officer's salary. And they make around $100,000 a year, so we want to make sure that the amount to be invested is at least $200,000, but it doesn't have to all be up front. You just have to show they've committed to it. Okay. What are the main requirements, including minimum investment to apply for an investor visa? This, I believe, is going to become even more important. An investor visa has 3 main requirements. By the way, this visa has been around for 50 years. The US has the identical visa called an E2. There were 52,000 E2s approved last year. These individuals get a 5-year work permit, maybe 3, but usually 5, and there's no path to permanent residence in the US. But they use them all the time. They renew them when they wait as long as till their kids are born in the US, grow up, marry Americans, become American citizens, then sponsor their parents, which, by the way, is a very fast process. Okay, so I mean that's what you want to do with the investor. Now, the main requirements are funds must already be placed at risk. You can't just say I got the money in the bank account. They have to either be spent on new equipment, new facilities, new everything, and then you apply. Or you have one option, and that is if you're going to buy an existing business, you have to have one condition where the monies go into the lawyer's trust account, and if you don't get your work permit, then you pay some fee to the seller for inconvenience, and you get your money back. The rest of it must be committed, and it must create jobs for Canadians. Not many, and not right away, but it has to create those jobs. Now, the good part about investors, you can also bring other individuals who have the same citizenship as you to help you grow your business, which is real handy for family members, etc. Okay? My recommendation is learn about treaty investors, a little bit about treaty traders, because with free trade, who knows? But learn about that program, okay? And then the business immigration pathways available in Canada. We've gone through all of those, thank goodness. Rest of the question, do you think recent changes in immigration will affect or completely eliminate the business SUV programs? Well, as far as I'm concerned, the SUV program is finished, okay? But it's still there. Just make sure the clients who are interested in the program don't listen to people who don't know. The realistic pathways for temporary foreign workers holding an LMIA supported job, basically keep them in status with their LMIA, renew it as often as you can, find other ways to keep them in status until a program comes up that they're eligible for. And so keep in contact with them, make sure you know what their abilities are. Interested in engaging closely with RCIC members? Well, we have a business called IMMC3. It's a matching service, if you will. We have 11 subject matter experts who can help you. We share fees, and we keep it simple, okay? When you get paid, we get paid. We share fees in a reasonable manner. When you don't need us because you've learned how to do these files, you don't need us, okay? So you can get more details at immc3.ca, the website. Have a look. It's free. How quickly will the current Canadian business immigration backlog be processed? Never. We don't know. I've given up completely in trying to figure things out. The immigration department still has major processing problems. And that's because their IT systems are fundamentally flawed and they're working on fixing them. I have no confidence that they'll get them right. Increasing expectation based on startups applying. Yeah. Forget about expectations on the startup visas. They're never going to get to process anyway. Okay? That's my opinion. Fastest route, express entry, absolutely express entry. Any provincial program is going to take longer. Okay? So if you have any other questions, please email them in to Joorney or to me. I'd be happy to answer them. I'm sorry I've had to rush through this, but hopefully this has given you some food for thought. I do appreciate very much, Joorney, the opportunity to talk with you, and I'm happy to answer offline any and all questions at phil@immc3.ca. Thanks, everyone.